Taking a deep breath in. Ah, and here we are. Welcome, dear YouTube familia. Let's go ahead and reground ourselves, breathing in peace and exhaling love, honoring this beautiful moment. So in today's talk, we're going to be going through a few different things. The main topic that I have on the piece of paper, again, I don't know what I'm going to put for the YouTube video yet, though, is death is not a failure. Plus, I'm going to be talking about the Dunisha ritual during autumn's twilight, or you might call it Samhain, or the time after Halloween, All Hallows Day, all that fun stuff. A lot of different cultures have different holidays and observations during this time of year. And so it's going to be important to note that today is not going to be a conversation about grief. I've given a lot of talks on a lot of sermons on grief, and there'll be more in the future. Today is more about understanding the nature of death, because this time of year, especially October 31st, November 1st, and November 2nd, a lot of cultures around the world observe this as a time when you honor your ancestors. You honor those who came before, you honor those who have passed on. And it's a celebration of death, but at the same time, it's a celebration of life. And a quote that I wrote here that I really enjoy is, "Birth and death are two sides of the same coin. Because both exist, life is possible. Every moment contains a birth and a death, with breath being the life in between. Without death, there can be no birth." So Thich Nhat Hanh and Soka Nanga, a lot of Zen masters actually go into great detail about death and how it's actually alive in every moment of our life. Because in every moment you are dying and you're also being reborn. If I went over and entered into this other room, what would be happening is I would be dying from this room and being born into that room. When I look at someone, I am being born into that interaction, that soul connection. When I look away, I die. When I look at another person, I'm born into that moment. And so there's teachings on this to when when you look at your wife or your husband, your spouse, be born into that moment. And maybe previously you were looking at your child or your friend. You need to allow that moment to die so that you can then be born into that momentary role that you're in. If you're a spouse, if you're a parent, be a parent in that moment. Now, we definitely know this when we are balancing work and family life. Who brings home work with them? And what happens is you're not allowing what was to die in that moment. You are still in the corporate mindset. We'll just use that as the example. And so we need to allow that hat to be removed and that experience, that role to die momentarily, so that when you enter into the household, you are then born anew. And so not only does it occur with our in-breath and our out-breath continuously throughout our life, and even as our cells are dying in this very moment and then being reborn, it's so fascinating. It's that we have it on a cellular level, we have it on a breath level, we have it from just looking from one person to the next person and entering and exiting different rooms, wearing different hats at different times. All of this contains life, which is the breath between birth and death that is happening perpetually. Even on the day ends and then the new day begins. We suffer because we don't recognize this. We forget this. We forget the importance of death in a way to where we push it, push it, push it, push it. We deny it. We deny it because of the discomfort that it brings on loss of loved ones, loss of things we care about, even the death of a job on a big scale where you're laid off or fired, or maybe you just up and quit, but then you have regrets. We think of death in that way, but we don't think of it as a moment-to-moment basis, and that's a great disservice to us, because how many of us are actually present on a day-to-day basis with our different interactions? Chances are you're carrying over ghosts of so many different activities. There might be 10 things going on in your brain at one time, when really what's in front of you is actually what's alive. Only, this is a Thich Nhat Hanh quote, only the present moment contains life. Write that down. I've said it many times, but it's such a beautiful reminder that only the present moment contains life. And and I'm going to touch on a bit of sadness and grief because it's important to bring that up. I don't want to not completely avoid that today. But for me, inner peace has really become possible because I really try to live with this mentality of, quote, only this moment. Obviously, I'm planning for the future. I have so many irons in the oven. I have so many projects going on right now that I have to manage. But when I'm not managing them, when it's not the appropriate time to, I'm not carrying them with me. You know, if the other day I was driving in the car with my father and I was having, food impacts me drastically. And I haven't had a certain protein drink because I'm a vegetarian. I get my protein from other sources. I haven't had a certain protein drink in the morning that normally really wakes me up and gets me going. I've been having a replacement. And I've noticed for most of my mornings, the first few hours, I don't feel that great. And so while we were driving, I noticed that would have been an old time of my life when I would have been short. I would have had a tone in my voice. Because during my more depressed years, when I was a child, figuring stuff out, I always had a fucking tone. I'm so sorry. Like, I was just a peach to be around. And it was just one of those things where I was reminding myself only this moment. You know, this is a beautiful moment we're getting to spend together. It doesn't matter what activity it is, but that's who I'm with is important. And they deserve full listening, they deserve full love. And so not only do I always remind myself of only this moment, even if I feel like shit, and so that helps me catch it if I'm going to go in a way that might be harmful, but also my job is to listen and to love. Constantly reminding myself to listen and to love, even if my head is hurting, even if I feel fatigue in my body. It doesn't require too much to just listen and to love, because through listening, you are showing love. Does that make sense? When we're irritable, when we have a tone, generally we don't even let other people finish their damn sentences. Who's done that before? And you just jump to what you think next. And what's interesting is when we don't feel well, we tend to complain more about things, don't we? You know, we see something and bleh, I don't like that. And so it's interesting that when you're reminding yourself that only this moment exists and you're reminding yourself perpetually to listen and to love, that has really transformed my life because I mean, this week alone has had various setbacks with our new property and other avenues we're going to have to take and these things. It's still going to work out in the end, I feel, within. But it's definitely added a lot of roadblocks that we were not anticipating. And the mind could easily go towards that. But no, I allow it to die until it's ready to be reborn in my consciousness. Write that down. Mm-hmm. Allow things to die until they're ready to be reborn in your consciousness. I like that. That was not on my notes, but I like it. Hashtag quote time. It's a hot damn nugget. Allow things to die in your consciousness until they're ready to be reborn. Or reborn could be revisited. And so let me take just a short transition to talking about grief, because, you know, we can't just talk about all these light subjects of death because it's a big one and it negatively impacts a lot of people's lives. And that's the fascinating thing, is that we always view death as a negative impactor, but there's plenty of positives that come along with it as well. But before I jump into that, let's talk about my main approach to grief, or rather Dunasha's main approach to grief. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but for those of you that it's new, it's fantastic to write down. Sadness with acceptance. Sadness plus acceptance equals appreciation. Now, within that appreciation, there's still sadness, but because there's acceptance, it allows appreciation to take root. It allows peace to exist. You know, the stages of grief, acceptance is the last one. And so it makes sense how once you go through the stages, you get to acceptance, you're able to actually have peace again. You're able to look back and have appreciation rather than grief. But now let's talk about how grief manifests. Sadness plus resistance equals grief. So when we're in resistance to what has happened, when we're in resistance to life itself, when we're in resistance to anything that we do not prefer, we're adding that grief into ourselves. Now, when it comes to sadness plus resistance equals grief, when it comes to resistance and anger, you're going to have strife. And so it manifests as different emotions. But the key thing we always want to look at when it comes to the death experience, whether it's physical death or the loss of a job, the loss of a friendship, it could be anything that you do not prefer that's changing in your life. When you're adding resistance, you're going to freaking suffer. You're going to turn it into suffering. When you're just accepting it for what it is, it's just going to be momentary pain. And that pain will resurface from time to time, but you're not feeding it that mentality that keeps it alive. You're not having a story or a belief system in your mind that this shouldn't have happened, or I wish it would have happened this way. And that reliving. And that's what the whole ghost thing comes into it, where you're carrying the ghosts of the past into the present moment. That keeps you from being right here, right now. Let's take a breath. So death's real name is change. That's all. Its real name is change. And so I think about it in this way. I feel like for someone who's 30, I've had a lot more relationships than the typical human at 30. And I'm not just talking about romantic. I'm talking about, because I've been a pastor for 10 years, I've had multiple communities, and so many people have come into my heart, because being a pastor is like having your heart open 24/7. No matter if it gets hurt, you just keep it open. And so there's been a lot of relationships that have come and gone in and out of my life. Some have beautifully lasted, and it's so wonderful. But there are plenty that were rough from the start and remained rough and are no longer here. But there's been some that were fantastic from the start, got rough, and then went out. Some that were always beautiful, and then for whatever reason they fell apart and they're no longer here. So it doesn't matter how they were, but they all of them impacted my life in some way, in a beautiful way, even the rough ones. But what's interesting is that, and one of my best friends actually shared this with me, saying that had the previous relationships I was close to not evaporated, then there would have been no room in my life for her to enter in. And what a beautiful blessing that is. And so it's the same way as even us leaving Arizona to come into Colorado. Although it was very painful to leave many of those relationships, obviously they're still there, but we're not seeing each other on a regular basis like we once did. That Andrew was saying, he would often remind me when we were crying in our mess here for 6 months, waiting, not always crying, but in the discomfort of waiting to see what is to bloom, what is to be born here. Because we went through the death experience, but now we were in limbo, and we had yet to meet anyone in this town, or even just a couple people. We didn't know who the community was going to be. We didn't know the heart connections we were going to meet. But what was interesting is that had we remained in Arizona and did the comfortable thing, we would have never met any of you lovely people, right? And so, although death doesn't always take the form of a hard transition, it does take many forms throughout our life. And I want you to remember, rather than viewing as death as something scary, we really want to remind ourselves that it is just, its real name is change. And I have dated a lot of people in my days, let's be honest. And there were a handful that I was very heartbroken over when they left, either by my choice or their choice. And because even if it was by my choice, I'd still sometimes suffer. But what's interesting is that even if my mind was so sure that that was it, that it was supposed to be longer lasting, then I would have never met Andrew. Does that make sense? And so we have this idea and this expectation of how life should look like. And as long as we're holding on to that expectation, that idea, we're really doing ourselves a disservice, because we're not allowing ourselves to actually see the miracles unfolding before us in the present moment. And it doesn't mean sadness and pain are not going to be there. There's always going to be there. It's being human. But it doesn't mean we have to suffer through it. It doesn't mean we have to suffer through it. I added a quote right here on the left page by Thich Nhat Hanh. Bottom of the left page, and it goes, "When we look up at the moon from the earth, we may think that the moon is so beautiful. But if we're on the moon and looking back at the earth, we see the earth's magnificence. We have lived on this planet for so many years, and yet have we truly been in touch with the wonders of life on earth? We argue with one person, we're jealous of another. We run after this and chase after that, and become blind to the beauties all around us. We don't realize what a miracle it is to be able to walk on this beautiful planet." And so Thich Nhat Hanh is notorious for always bringing our awareness back to the beauty that exists before our eyes in every moment. And that's what he teaches his monks. And that's what we teach you. You know, I think of often the Holocaust and how the individuals that survived it, especially those who were Jewish, but there was more people in it as well, and how those who lost everything, how were they even allowed, how was it possible to smile again after that? And yet, if you've ever seen anyone who's been in a concentration camp give a speech, they're always peaceful people, and there's always deep compassion in their eyes and in their voice, and their biggest concern is we must never allow this to happen again, and by making sure it never happens again, we must love. There's always this unifying voice from the people who've been through concentration camps and lost everything. It's never one of anger or justice or vengeance, because they recognize that's what got them to that point. And so sadness with acceptance equals an appreciation for life. Sadness with resistance, such as I wish this didn't happen, how could this happen, I'm so angry, fuck them, equals grief and suffering, keeps the heart from healing. And this is where I go back to the whole just love and listen. If we literally just open our ears and open our eyes and we pay attention, you're going to notice that wisdom's constantly around us. We don't have to go through that experience to gain the wisdom that they're sharing. But when we close our mind off, then we repeat the lessons. Something I reflected on recently was stop holding yourself and others accountable for the past. Instead, look at today's actions and behavior. Stop holding yourself and others accountable for the past. Instead, look at today's actions and behaviors. Because obviously, even in my beingness, in my life, there's been times where I wish I would have handled certain circumstances or situations or relationships better. But I look back and then I remind myself that version of myself is dead. It's not real anymore. Who I was then is not who I am now, and I give myself permission to let that go. Because sometimes there can be so much grief or guilt or shame that we hold on to. But if we had a teleportation device, and we put your consciousness today into the consciousness of who you were at that time, even if it was in a time of abuse, you would likely have different behaviors and different responses to what was going on. That would lead to a different outcome. Maybe the abuse would have still happened to you, but the way you would have processed it would have been different. The way you would have responded would have been different. Maybe it would have not changed the way another person behaved towards you, but maybe you would have been less abusive to the other person. And normally what we hold on to is the shit we've done to other people, less of what they've done to us. Not always, but for a lot of people, it's sometimes harder to forgive the self than to forgive others. And so I thought about that. It's like giving myself permission that I have changed, and giving other people permission that they have changed as well. And so I look back at different people or conversations, and I wonder, I'm like, isn't it interesting that even if there was a disagreement 5-10 years ago, wouldn't it be lovely to even just sit down and have a conversation now and laugh about it? Or just say, oh my gosh, I was a shithead. And then they might say the same thing, and then it's a beautiful reconciliation. But a lot of people don't allow that, because it's almost like those moments in time become frozen. and they demonize you, or you demonize others, or we demonize ourselves, and we don't recognize that every day, every year, there's perpetually death occurring around us, within us, and that we're constantly changing, becoming new people, and to give ourselves permission to allow that change to occur. Interesting, isn't it? Pema Chodron has really taught me that, because with, even in Buddhist communities, there are sex scandals that abuse have arisen out of. And Pema Chodron, with the Me Too movement, everything that has been shown, one of her greatest teachers had harmed someone. And that young girl came to Pema Chodron and was expressing it years and years and years ago. And Pema Chodron dismissed it. And she just didn't believe the woman at the time. But now, 30, 40 years later, maybe more, I don't know exactly, she called up the woman and just mentioned, they had a beautiful conversation. She apologized. And Pema Chodron was stating, she's like, I have to give myself permission to change. I'm not that person anymore who did that thing. But I can still take accountability that in that moment, I really did hurt that woman. I did not hear her. And what a beautiful thing that is, because a lot of times, if, especially spiritual leaders, if they do one bad thing, that's it. We lose all trust in them, rather than acknowledging that we're still all human, we're still all growing, we're still all changing. And so I love that lesson that Pema Chodron taught, and it actually allowed me to heal some just small things still within me, because we hold ourselves to such a strong standard. Interesting, isn't it? And I think that's a lesson we can all really take and we can all learn from. Yes? So let's breathe that in. What I love about death is that it's a unifying universal truth. Thich Nhat Hanh says, if we live with the understanding of impermanence, we cultivate and nurture our love. If we live with the understanding of impermanence, we cultivate and nurture our love. Who's taking shit for granted? And then when you lose said shit, you're like, damn, I wish I was more present during that. I wish I had one more moment, one more day. But you stop wishing that when you've actually been living fully, if that makes sense. When we live fully in the present moment, it's impossible to wish to do things differently, because you're actually fully with it. But it's easy to have regrets when you're not living fully with it. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to sometimes wish that things happen differently, or that you can spend one more day with someone that you had loved that's passed over. But what I love about death in particular is that it reminds us and it gives us fuel to be present in the now, and to really make sure we're not taking things for granted. It is the angel of death that comes around every so often. It influences our lives, and it reminds us to live our life to the fullest. That is what's fascinating to me about certain religions and certain cultures, where if a spouse dies, it's like, that's it. You're in black for the rest of your life. No more joy. Just grieve. But what a great disservice that is to the actual meaning that death provides us with change, and that person's passing over, because the ego, at least, again, we cannot prove one way or another, but I like to think that the ego is more of a human thing. And when we transition over, if there is still that ability to connect, there will be an egolessness on the other side, and our loved one will want us to be happy and to live life fully. And if there is that belief that they have some enlightenment that crosses over, or Abraham Hicks says, when you croak, you join the galactic soup. You just instant alignment. Enlightenment in a can. And if that is true, they would wish us to make sure that we are living. Yes? And so we must not use them as an excuse for our non-living. We must not use them as an excuse for our non-aliveness. Interesting, isn't it? But what's interesting too is that when we look at death as a daily occurrence, and we accept it in all forms, it does become easier. Because if we're someone that resists every fucking damn thing, when we're constantly in negativity 24/7, we see things, I don't like that. We're in that resistant mode. Is it any wonder why people stuck in that behavior are going to suffer more when actual loss occurs? But when we're practicing freshness every day and practicing the mind of aliveness in each moment, only this moment of listening and love, even when the death experience comes to ourselves or other people, we are more prepared. And so this is just something I wrote down. Deep compassion arises out of deep understanding, and deep understanding arises out of deep listening. I just thought that was a beautiful thing to add. Deep compassion arises out of deep understanding, and deep understanding arises out of deep listening. And deep listening is just pay attention. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. Give your presence to this moment. Give your presence to this moment. Something I forgot to say, but new experiences is born on the heels of old ones past. New experiences is born on the heels of old ones past. And so we're going to go ahead and move into our third point of today, or our finale of it. And it's the Dunasha ritual during autumn's twilight. And so autumn's evening, autumn's twilight, that's just kind of the time we're in right now. November 1st is technically mid-autumn. And so it's the time where autumn reaches its peak, and now we're slowly transitioning into winter until the winter solstice, when winter officially begins. So Dunasha is our spirituality that really honors the seasons, the cycles, and we gain a lot of wisdom from it. And the purpose of so many of the rituals that we do in Dunasha is that ritual brings us back to the present moment. And so when we have rituals throughout the seasons, even during full moons and new moons, is that it's just perpetual moments given by nature itself that invite us back to the present moment, that invite us back to the peace teachings, so that we could show up more fully on a day-to-day basis. And so for lack of a better word, I'm just going to call it Samhain, even though it's more Gaelic and Celtic, but I just lack it. And so during this time, it was technically, today's the second, yes, so it's technically yesterday. Third. Is it the third? Well, I have a second on our little thingamajig. So for 9 days and 9 nights in a row, we light incense and a candle for our ancestors and loved ones who have transitioned. 9 days or 9 nights, whenever you prefer to do it. And so what incense does is, incense in a lot of traditions, especially Buddhist traditions, is it's an offering. And the candle for us is representing the ancestral flame. It's that spark of life that continues on. And so what do you think, if this was a one-on-one session, we'd have a back and forth, but just think of this internally. What do you think happens to your mind, your body, your attention, your spirit, when you have a ritual for 9 days in a row and you're lighting an incense and a candle with the intent of invoking, with the intent of respecting and honoring? You're bringing something to mind. It changes your perception a bit. It slows down the mind. Ritual has a beautiful tendency to bring our awareness back to the moment, slowing it down. And when we do this for 9 days out of the year, and there's other holidays that we reflect that have another 9 day of incense lighting and candle lighting as well, but they're for different intentions. But when we actually practice this for 9 days consistently, you're taking the time to honor, to reconnect, and to not avoid death, but to embrace it and the meaning of change that it offers. So it's this beautiful symbology of taking the time to actually speak to your ancestors or loved ones on the other side for 9 days in a row. gaining the wisdom from it. Maybe you have a picture of them and then you reflect on the message that their life held and what it passes on to you. But then also it is a reminder to make sure that we're not taking life for granted. Which brings us to one more aspect of this lovely time of year, which is for those 9 days, we give up something. We reflect the sacrifice that they made of flesh, which they had a sacrifice that gave up all the earthly pleasures. So what would that mean if we, for just 9 days, gave up one earthly pleasure? And how, when we give up earthly pleasures for limited time, it actually allows us to appreciate it more. Andrew and I learned that the hard but lovely way when we were living in this environment during construction, and we didn't have a bed for 6 months. We didn't have a shower or a bath for 6 months. We weren't able to cook food for 6 months. We had no privacy for 6 months. And so going through that very uncomfortable time really mellowed me out, man. It really did, because I didn't have shit, you know? Literally, I just had, all of our belongings were in storage. I just had a computer, my laptop to write on, and it allowed me to finish the second edition of Living Peace, which was fantastic. But not having a bed, not having a shower, I was on one of those inflatable air mattresses, and then every morning I wake up, it's deflated. And just none of the comforts or luxuries. And so giving that up for a very long time helped me really appreciate it when it returned. And what's nice is because it was such a long amount of time, it almost like it stuck in me. For 9 days, you may not, after the 9th day, maybe 2 weeks, you're doing good after that, but probably after a month, you're probably back to your own routines, unless you keep it alive in your consciousness. But really think about that this today, and choose something to give up for 9 days. Something that you enjoy. And when you find it difficult to do it, or when you find the urge to revisit, maybe it's something that you're addicted to, or maybe it's something that's fun. It could be anything, but just something that you normally do daily that is somehow a comfort or a pleasure, relinquish it for 9 days. And what's beautiful about that is you're going to notice that in that discomfort, your mind's going to go towards that. And the other things that bother you are not going to be as important. And when you also are lighting that incense every evening and you're lighting that candle, you're taking that moment of awareness. What that does is it's changing your brain chemistry around. You're creating new neural pathways of thinking in different ways. And you're honoring, you're respecting, you're in gratitude, you're thanking. Collectively not taking life for granted because you're touching life. Quite beautiful, yes. And so during Samhain, during autumn's twilight, that's one of the things we like to do as Tunisha monks. And of course, even just our members and people around the world practice this as well. There's another one, February 1st, May 1st, and August 1st, but this one in particular has to do with the ancestors. So let's breathe that in. So I hope today's conversation gave us a little bit more of an appreciation of the word death and how its real name, its true name is change. And so reflecting on that as we go about the next couple of weeks will be quite beautiful. And it will create a little bit of freshness in our life if we allow it. So thank you all so much for joining in. As always, links are down below if you'd like to give any donations or set up some one-on-one sessions with me. It's always a joy. And as always, thank you. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Feel free to share it. Feel free to leave some comments letting us know what you liked, or if you ever have any questions for future sermons. Until then, blessed be.